Asia is not just going to become one center; it's going to become the center. But of course, within Asia, there'll be multiple poles. By the way, Asia itself will be multipolar, not just part of a multipolar world. And certainly, the key point I emphasize in my writings is that the 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of, China and India.
Mhm.
So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. But this Western domination was always an aberration. It has come to an end, and it's ending very fast. And I always give one statistic to illustrate this. If you compare the combined economy of the European Union with China, in the year 2000, the combined economy of the European Union was 8 times bigger than China, right? Today, they're about the same size.
Yeah.
And by 2050, Europe will be half the size of China. And, for the Europeans, they got to understand that when you go from being 8 times bigger than China towards becoming half the size of China in 50 years, you got to learn to treat China with more respect. Instead of making these condescending comments that European leaders, I think it's important for Europeans to understand that if you look objectively at the world today, Europe represents the past. I mean, it does, by the way, represent a beautiful past. And so I actually believe that Europe is going to become, in some ways, a very nice museum for the world. The United States of America represents the present, but Asia represents the future. That's where all the future growth is going to come from. And it's better for the Europeans to adapt to this change in advance rather than to resist it. And certainly, acceptance means that you got to make real concessions, for example, in places like IMF and the World Bank, and not insist that the European voting share must still remain disproportionately high. I mean, certainly the war in Ukraine is a tragedy, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. It should be condemned. But at the same time, it's a war that could have been prevented if the Europeans had shown some degree of geopolitical competence. And the European geopolitical incompetence is also responsible for this war, because the Europeans completely ignored some real and legitimate security concerns of Russia in the build-up to the war. And certainly the Gaza war is a tragedy, and certainly a war in Venezuela would also be a tragedy. But if you look at Asia by and large, what is stunning is that China has managed to grow its economy dramatically, as I have just demonstrated, becoming the same size of European Union despite being 1/8 the size in the year 2000. But China has achieved this rise peacefully. And normally, when great powers emerge, they never emerge peacefully. I mean, Graham Allison, in his book, Destined for War, has said that Americans should not wish that China should be like America, because when America emerged as a great power in the 1890s, it was very violent. It declared wars on Spain, conquered Philippines, conquered some of the neighbors. So clearly, China's peaceful emergence has been a gift to the world. And that's why the West should appreciate this and accept the fact that China's rise has been peaceful, instead of trying to thwart China's rise and therefore create a lot of problems for the world. Happy to live with the current global order that was created by the West in 1945 at the end of World War II. So you look at all the major global institutions, the United Nations family of institutions like World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, you name it. They were all created by the West at the peak of its power at the end of World War II. Now, in theory, with Asia rising, Asia can say, hey, We don't want these Western institutions. We want to create our own. But actually, the Asians want to keep these institutions. But of course, these institutions got to adapt and accept Asia's return. So, for example, within the UN, you have a UN Security Council. In theory, it has 15 members, but in practice, as Singapore discovered when we were members of the council in 2001, 2002, that there are actually 5 members who control the council, the P5, and which is, of course, United States, Russia, China, UK, France. And the 10 members are the 10 other elected members are observers, basically. The council is controlled by the 5. But, that's not a bad thing to have a veto, 5 permanent members, with a veto. But you got to represent the great powers of today and not the great powers of yesterday. That's what the Security Council was designed to have. And so, for example, you take UK, for example, right? And I mean, I'll compare UK with India, okay? And the reason I compare UK with India is that 100 years ago, the British could rule India effortlessly. It's shocking that 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians. Amazing, right? Now, that world is, of course, it won't happen again. But even as recently as the year 2000, the British economy was 3.5 times bigger than the Indian economy. Today, of course, the Indian economy is bigger, but by 2050, the Indian economy will be 4 times bigger than the British economy. Now, when that day comes, it will be absurd to have the UK as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and India not as a member. So if the British want to be gracious about it, the British should say, okay, India is now a much more powerful country than me. The British should graciously give up their permanent seat in the UN Security Council to India. And when I wrote this article for the Financial Times, I thought the Financial Times wouldn't print it. To my surprise, they printed it. So I think the more thoughtful British realize that the time has come for the British to give up their seat in the UN Security Council to India. But that's the sort of thing. These are the sort of changes you need to make. So you keep the institution of the UN, but you change the composition. ASEAN is definitely a role model for the world. Because, we haven't discussed some of the other changes happening in the world. And I always say that the new world that is coming is what I call a 3M world, And the 3M meaning that it will be multi-civilizational, multipolar, and multilateral. And the reason why the world needs to study ASEAN is that ASEAN is the most successful multi-civilizational club in the world. In fact, no other region of the world is as diverse as Southeast Asia is. Indeed, among the close to 700 million people in Southeast Asia, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and you also have lots of communists in Southeast Asia. So it is by far the most diverse region of planet Earth. Yet it has preserved itself as an oasis of peace and prosperity. So what ASEAN has done is ASEAN has provided a multi-civilizational laboratory for the world so you can understand how different civilizations can live with each other in peace. And that's what the 21st century is going to be all about, because the Western civilization has got to learn to live in peace with stronger Chinese civilization, stronger Indian civilization, stronger Islamic civilization. And the reason why ASEAN is the only one that can offer a model, because if you look at the European Union, for example, the European Union has been around much longer than ASEAN, but it still remains a Christian club. And, Turkey has applied to join for, 30, 40 years now. And the fact that the European Union cannot even admit one Islamic member shows that the European Union is psychologically not preparing itself for a multi-civilizational world, but ASEAN is teaching the world how to live in a multi-civilizational world. Relatively speaking, in Asia, the major powers are not building alliance structures. So China is not building an alliance structure. India is not building an alliance structure. Indonesia is not building an alliance structure. Of course, some Asian states are allies of the West, of United States. I mean, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand. But at the same time, they're also pragmatic. Even though they're allies of the United States, they're still keeping up their good ties with China. Although, as you know, right now, Japan and China seem to be having a very difficult patch. But they've gone through difficult patches before and they've come out of it. So I hope they'll come out this difficult patch too. But the notion of creating exclusive alliances is not part of the Asian tradition because we are much more inclusive. We say that we'd rather have people who are different from us in the same club because we have to live with people who are different from us and not similar to us. So within ASEAN, for example, the West, for example, under the Western system, you have to be a democracy before you can join the Western alliance, right? But some of the states in ASEAN are democracies, some are not democracies. We say, okay, you choose your political system. We don't pass judgment on it. We accept you for what you are, and we will live with you. And that's the acceptance of diversity is a big asset of Asia rather than the Western tradition of creating like-minded alliances. Certainly, in the case of the most Asian countries, for example, I mean, there's no question. My book Has China Won, which you mentioned, tries to explain why the US-China contest will definitely accelerate over the next 10 to 20 years. This is normal because the world's number one power will never give up its position gracefully. He will always try to push down the number one emerging power. So the fact that the United States is pushing down China is logical, predictable behavior of any number one power. So we should not be surprised by it. But what's interesting is that, unlike in the case of the Cold War, when the United States was very successful in recruiting allies, both in advanced European countries and also among developing countries. I mean, in the Cold War, countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, and to some extent even China were allies of the United States in the Cold War. But this time around, in the contest between the United States and China, almost all the major countries in the world, especially in the global south, have said, we're not taking sides. We want to be friends with the United States of America. We want to be friends with China. And I think that's the pattern. That's the pattern. And certainly among the 11 ASEAN countries, they have made their position very clear. They want to be friends with the United States and they want to be friends with China, and they don't want to take sides. And that in general also reflects the position of the global south countries too. So for example, the European states, for example, right? They could have also chosen to be an independent pole. And in the geopolitical contest between the United States and China, they could have chosen to be friends with the United States and be friends with China, right? And that will be a sensible thing for Europe to do, because in many ways, in the long run, the biggest challenge for Europe is not going to come from Russia. Russian tanks are not going to invade Germany or France anymore. In fact, the biggest challenge to Europe is going to come from the demographic explosion in Africa, right? And in the year 1950, Europe's population was double that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is 2.5 times bigger than Europe's. By 2100, Africa's population could be 10 times bigger than Europe. So Europe has got a very important vested interest in the economic development of Africa. Because and so every dollar invested in Africa is a gift to Europe because it creates jobs for Africans to stay in Africa. So when China is now the biggest investor in Africa. So when China invests in Africa, Europe should send China a thank you note and say, thank you for investing in Africa because you are creating jobs in Africa. But instead of thanking China for investing in Africa, the Europeans have shown their geopolitical incompetence by slapping China, criticizing China for investing in Africa. So this is a classic case of shooting yourself in your own foot when you criticize China. So I find when I listen to the European leaders like Elizabeth von der Leyen, Kaya Kallas or Annalena Baerbock, the former foreign minister of Germany, I find that they don't step back and do a very rational, pragmatic, long-term strategic calculation of what are Europe's interests in the long run and what should Europe do to protect itself in the long run. So I'm actually, in some ways, the best friend that Europe has because I'm trying to tell the Europeans, look at your own interests. And your own interests dictate that you should not necessarily take the side of the United States against China because your interest, geopolitics is a combination of two words, geography and politics. And because the geography of Europe is different from the geography of the United States, it makes sense for Europe to say, okay, when it comes to our geography, we need to work with China to create jobs in Africa, right? And not join the United States in blocking Chinese investments in Africa. And in some ways, Donald Trump should be seen as a gift to Europe because Donald Trump is saying, my mission is not to make Europe great again. My mission is MAGA, to make America great again. And so Europe should say, okay, if your mission is to make America great again, our mission is to make Europe great again. And therefore, Europeans should become more pragmatic in the way that they handle their geopolitical issues. But as Henry Kissinger told me in his last one-on-one conversation, the quality of mind of European leaders has gone down a lot. And they're not able to engage in long-term strategic thinking in the way that previous generations of leaders could do so. There was a famous British statesman, Lord Palmerston, I think his name was, who said that countries don't have permanent friends. They don't have permanent enemies. They only have permanent interests. Now, in the Cold War, there was it wasn't the values that brought United States and European Union together. There was a convergence of interests. Both felt equally threatened by the Soviet Union. And they say, okay, if you have a common enemy, you cooperate, right? The Soviet Union was right there at the border of Europe. In fact, Soviet tanks were very close to Germany. So it made sense for Germany to form a close alliance with the United States of America. Now, China is 12,000 kilometers. The gap between Brussels and Beijing is 12,000 kilometers or more. China is not a threat to Europe. So, in that case, if you want to look after your own interests, as by the way, Donald Trump is actually, to be fair to him, looking after American interests very well, right? He's taking care of American interests. So I think
certain parts.
So therefore, Europe should also learn to take care of its own interests and decide where its interests converge and where its interests diverge. Because in the long run, geopolitical alliances are not based on values; they are based on interests, as Lord Palmerston said. And the European Union needs to do a complete strategic reboot and figure out where its interests lie. Because without doing the strategic reboot, the Europeans are making mistakes. For example, there's Susan Glasser, a New Yorker writer. She wrote recently that the current European policy is one of practicing strategic self-abasement.
Mhm.
Now, that's like her words, strategic self-abasement. Now, strategic self-abasement means kowtowing. Now, you never get the respect of anyone when you kowtow. So the Europeans should therefore work out their own independent foreign policy and not rely just only on, relying on others to save their interests.